I think people will join in as we go. Good evening to everyone who's joining in with us. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day. So today our AdvoChats is on the topic is Don't Tax My Period. We organized this session in light of the recent 15% general duty removal on imported menstrual products in Sri Lanka. So we all know that Sri Lanka's imported menstrual products have been taxed at high rates over the years. So today we are going to talk about the impact this has on low-income earning menstruating women and girls. We're going to talk about the impact this has on Sri Lanka's period poverty, very importantly, and also something else that we're going to talk about is the room this general duty removal has created to advocate for further reforms that needed to ensure affordability of menstrual products in Sri Lanka. So I have Anuki Premachandra with me. I think all of you know she's been very vocal about this issue. And also we have Malsha Kumaranatunge, once again someone who has been very vocal about ensuring the availability and affordability of menstrual products in Sri Lanka. And also Lakmini Jayathilake, formerly she was at Oxfam. She's done a lot of work on this as well. So thank you everyone for joining in with us. So without further ado, I think let's start by talking about the actual policy issue behind this. Anuki, I think, when you were at the Advocata Institute, you were one of the very first few people who started talking about the policy issue behind this. Because when we talk about taxing menstrual products, of course, it has a lot of socio-economic issues that impact it has on menstruating women and girls, especially low-income earning menstruating women and girls. But let's kickstart the conversation by talking about the real policy issue here. So, Anuki, we'll start off with you, and then we can kind of, continue the conversation.
Sure. Just let me know, Sathya, if at any time you guys can't hear me. First, thank you to you and to Advocata for having all of us, for having this conversation. We know that still, it's still a 15% gen duty that's off, and there's still a little more way to go when it comes to tariff removal. But I really appreciate, all of us having this conversation today. So in terms of a policy perspective, and Sathya, you can add to this as well, because you've done quite a bit of research on the issue already. I think the biggest issue here to me is that the tax around sanitary napkins was just not discussed for the longest time. It was not something that was flagged as an issue, that led to inaccessibility. It wasn't flagged as an issue, why women were still not converting to sanitary napkins or further into more sustainable menstrual hygiene products. And I think that's really where, to me, the issue lies. Just a lack of discussion around this within, the policy space. And that meant not really talking about the implications, for example, of the tax. So right now, I think within the policy space, what the attempt is to try to remove or to reduce the tariff, because right now, I mean, with everyone who's joined our conversation, and I see quite a lot of women on the live with us. I mean, you guys would already know this. There's very little product in the market. Most of the aisles are empty. A lot of the lower cost alternatives are actually wiped out, and that is a very, very unfortunate reality because we're living in a crisis. It's that you don't have electricity, I might lose it in a bit. Food it's very difficult to purchase day-to-day things. So I feel like situations like this really exacerbated the stress behind period poverty, and I think that's where this conversation is in a policy space.
Right, Anuki, thank you very much. I think you kind of brought the conversation to where it necessarily should be. I mean, it's highly commendable that this 15% general duty has been taken away. But while commending the government on these much needed steps towards the right direction, I think our attention should be on the fact that there is still a 10% PAL and a 15% cess on menstrual products in Sri Lanka, right? And I think let's kind of talk about why these tariffs become problematic. But before going into why the tariff is problematic, to kind of like understand what exactly a tariff is. So to kind of explain in the simplest term, a tariff is a tax imposed on any imported product at the border, right? So when we're talking about the Sri Lanka's border taxes are a mixture of tariffs and para-tariffs are simply like a tax on a tax at the border, right? So when we talk about para-tariffs on imported products, I'm once again talking about this cess and para, right? So when we talk about why this is so problematic, it's because it trickles down to the final retail price, making menstrual products, imported menstrual products, quite unaffordable in the market. To kind of show the unaffordability to you, we've looked at the retail prices of menstrual products from last year to this year, both locally produced and imported. And I'll kind of read those price increases to you. It's quite alarming actually. The average retail price of a locally produced sanitary napkin packet with 8 pieces have increased by 30.41%. So that's quite a big increase. I mean, when we talk about 2022 prices, we've looked at retail prices from January to May, and I'm speaking of the average price here. And also in terms of a locally produced sanitary napkin packet with 10 pieces, the average retail price have increased by 30.06%. And also when talking about a sanitary napkin packet which is locally produced with 20 pieces, the average retail price have increased by 26.78%, right? And most importantly, I think something we've noticed is that when we looked at the retail prices of imported sanitary napkin packet, we looked at a sanitary napkin packet with 15 pieces, we saw that the per packet price have not increased, but very interestingly, when you look at per pad price, the imported per pad price is more expensive than the most expensive locally produced sanitary napkin per pad price, right? So I mean, once again, that shows the importance of, removing these tariffs on. Anuki, are you still here with us? Okay, so till Anuki connects with us again. So once again, I think it shows. Okay, so once again, I think it shows the importance of, removing these tariffs, and most importantly, the para tariffs that are still there, the cess and pal on menstrual products in Sri Lanka. And also when talking about how these para tariffs kind of trickle down to the final retail price, I think Anuki, you also have spoken about this extensively. I think something else we need to talk about is the competition, right? What happens to competition in terms of this? So as we all know, there is this one big brand of imported, one popularizing major imported sanitary napkin brand that comes into the market. And then when there are tariffs and para tariffs imposed on this, what happens is that it becomes quite unaffordable in the domestic market, as I've explained earlier, right? And what this essentially does is it creates the room for the few domestic producers to mark up their prices to match up to the inflated price of the imported product, right? So what we essentially see here is that these local producers making a supernormal profit. So simply a supernormal profit is them making more profits than they essentially should. And what's so sad here and what's so heartbreaking is the fact that these supernormal profits are made at the expense of menstruating women and girls in Sri Lanka. Over 5 million menstruating women and girls between the age of 15 to 49. And when I talk about this 5 million menstruating women and girls, I'm also talking about low income earning menstruating women and girls who are a part of this, right? Who might not necessarily have a lot of money that they can keep aside to even purchase menstrual products. So I think that's something that we have to talk about here. And also most importantly, Anuki, I think you also highlighted this whole issue of rent seeking behavior. This kind of protection that local producers, seek from the government, it's largely termed as rent seeking
Yeah.
behavior. And what it essentially does is it leaves no incentive for local producers to stay price competitive, like I've been explaining this whole time, to kind of improve the quality and variety of their products, right?
Yeah.
And once again, it is inconveniencing menstruating women and girls in Sri Lanka. So that's something I wanted to kind of bring our attention to. And once again, Anupi, I know you've spoken about choice. I know you've spoken about how, having these tariffs and para tariffs curtails choice, how there's
Yeah.
very limited number of imported products coming into the market. Let's talk
Yeah.
about choice. Let's talk about what this does to, women in Sri Lanka. And I mean, the choice that we need in terms of menstrual products differs according to our biological needs as well, right? Let's talk about choice
Absolutely.
a bit more.
Sure. So I think this is a conversation that we've been having these past few weeks when it comes to taking the tariff off as well. Because at the end of the day, we've had enough and more policymakers just say, oh, like, but I've seen it, I've seen it available in the supermarket. Like, isn't this enough? And we're always like, no, we're talking about the biological process of a woman. And it's different from woman to woman. It's different as you age. It's different based on the sports you play. And that, with that sort of biological changes, we require a certain sense of choice. If you prefer to have if you prefer to use a sanitary napkin with, say, wings, without wings, and there's other options in terms of absorption, I think it depends on your flow. So what we're saying is, when you do have all of these regulatory barriers that end up pricing the product so high and out of financial reach of hundreds of women, you are essentially taking that choice away from it. So this argument about choice and having choice that equates to your biological process, I mean, I used to really harp on it about a year or two ago. But right now, given the state we're in, now it's a matter of choosing whether to, wear, for example, a pad or spend it on something and look to like a rag cloth instead. The conversation of choice has come to that. And I think that's why, we were thinking, I mean, reform right now needed to be critical.
Yeah, and also I think something we need to really talk about is this 15% gender duty removal, right? Malsha, I'd like to move my attention to you. As a woman in politics and policy, I'm so sure that this is something that hits home, right? That's closer to home. So could you talk about, I know that you've done a lot of work in terms of ensuring affordability and availability, especially availability of menstrual products for low income earning women in Sri Lanka. We'll talk about that as we go on. So as a woman in politics, can you tell me what do you feel about the removal of this 15% gender duty and how do you view this in terms of policy? Because in my personal point of view, I believe that this has created room for us to advocate for the further removal of the cess and pal, right? To advocate for further affordability of menstrual products. What do you think as a woman in politics and policy?
I think we have been trying to remove these taxes for a very long time. Through Free to Flow, we've been having discussions with many finance ministers that have come before this. But we were always told that they didn't feel like it was important enough right now. Like they had bigger problems to worry about. And I remember the former finance minister also telling us that it was a very small amount and he didn't think that it was important enough to remove the tax, that it doesn't really affect anyone. So I came back with saying, well, if it isn't important enough, why can't you remove it? Because it's not really, it's as Anuki said, 0.002% income. Yeah, so finally we managed to get to the table. Anuki was also with me. And we managed to get the general duty removed. We are having further discussions on removing cess and pal. And I hope in the coming weeks that we're able to do that as well. We're hopeful. At least we're getting somewhere now. And yeah, fingers crossed, it looks a little brighter on the other side.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you. And I know both you and Anuki played a big role in terms of speaking to the Prime Minister and getting, removing this 15% gender duty applicable on menstrual products. I'd like to move my attention to Lakmini as well. Lakmini, in terms of speaking, this 0.005% of revenue that is generated by tariffs imposed on menstrual products. I know that you've spoken about this many times. Could you walk us through this? What is your view? How do you view this removal of the 15% gender duty?
I think, Sathya, what we also need to look at is the fact that firstly, this goes to show that Sri Lanka historically has never had gender budgeting. It's to do with the fact that also in politics, you have 95% of men making decisions for 52% of the population, right? Quite frankly, this is the reality. And hence, because it is also very interlinked. The fact that we don't have gender budgeting goes into showing how they just do not care about issues that relate to women. But what we also now need to start understanding is that by imposing such a large tax on majority of the population, it has a huge economic and health cost. Because what it does is, one is with Sri Lanka having free education, you also normalize absenteeism. So the government pays every day a certain amount per child to go to school. When you make it impossible for a child to go to school while she's menstruating, the government also loses out money. And it's the same when it comes to the formal economy. For the past 2 decades, Sri Lanka has had a stagnant rate of women in the formal economy of 35%. 30 to 35% has been where we have been. Right, and one of the major reasons for this is because we don't have a conducive environment for women to participate in the formal economy. And things like this, specifically very women-centric taxes that are imposed just on part of the population, play a significant role in women's contribution to the formal economy. So if you want to take if the government actually, if they don't want to look at it as a women's issue, they also need to look at it from a very overall perspective, because by imposing the tax, you're only making less than 0.005% with this general tax taken out also. So I'm assuming that the amount that the government makes is going to be lesser, right? So if they can definitely let go of this, right? One is that. Number two is infrastructure. That's one of the major reasons as to why women and girls don't partake in the formal economy and at school. And what we also now start to, I think, we need to start changing how we frame this, because this is a rights issue. This is no longer the fact that, I mean, yes, this is a poverty problem, all of that, but you are also, by imposing such a sexist, right, tax, what you're doing is you are taking away the right of a child to participate in school. You're taking the ability of a woman to participate in the labor force. So I think we also just now we need to start changing the narrative and start looking at it from a very rights perspective as well. I mean, of course, yes, we understand that there is a plethora of things that are involved when we talk about period poverty, but we also need to start advocating, because this is a rights issue. You are curtailing a child's ability to go to school at least few days of the week, which is unfair. So yeah, so I mean that's my take on it.
And
Yeah,
also,
thank you, Lakmini. Yeah, of course, Masha, go ahead, please.
sorry for butting in, but we live in a country where watches are being bought into the country, but something so small like the pads we use are being taxed. So the only reason
Yeah.
I can see is why is watch taxed, because the man needs it.
Mm.
That's the only thing, actually, because if they need pads, I'm sure it's everywhere.
Exactly.
Of course, I think we can move our attention to speaking about period poverty as well, because last year, I think mid last year, we calculated Sri Lanka's absolute household period poverty rate, and we found that it was approximately 50%. So this simply means that around half the households with menstruating women in Sri Lanka do not necessarily report buying sanitary napkins or sanitary towels as a part of their household expenditure. And you can, even by that number, you can see how severe the issue is. But remember, this was mid last year, and now just a few minutes ago, I read out the numbers to you, from how many percentages both locally produced and imported sanitary napkins have increased their retail prices. So, I mean, definitely, I think it's safe to conclude the fact that the absolute household period poverty rate may have definitely increased, right, with the number of low-income earning menstruating women and girls in Sri Lanka. So let's talk about period poverty as a whole. I'd like to move my attention to Anuki one more time. So, Anuki, I mean, what are your views on period poverty, and what impact do you think, I mean, Sri Lanka's economic condition also at the moment, right? We have to take things such as inflation into consideration. There's inflation, and then on top of that, there is still a cess and a pal. So how are women going to tackle this issue, right? So let's kind of start from talking about period poverty.
So, like you correctly said, Sathya, and I've been kind of using this number that you guys calculated quite a bit, the fact that we have a period poverty rate of 50%. So everyone watching, period poverty is where you it refers basically to a lack of access to menstrual hygiene products, lack of financial access to menstrual hygiene products, if I term it. And in this case, where, talking about, since we're talking about the tax, we're talking about sanitary napkins specifically. And this is a big problem, because I remember during the pandemic, and this was an example that we drew to, the minute a packet of salmon was price controlled, I think it was price controlled at 100. And at that point in time, and this was it's 2022, so it was 2020, I think. So when they price controlled a salmon to 100, a packet of pads starting price was still 130. So at that point, a salmon was cheaper than buying pads. And that is kind of how I explain period poverty to people, because I say, look, the salmon can feed a family of 4. But averagely, if it's a family of like 3 girls, mom and 2 daughters, who are menstruating, their cost of on pads just every month would be quite a bit of their household income.
There are also clearly women in the same family with different physical conditions, right? That may
Correct.
require more sanitary napkins per person, right? I mean,
Correct.
these are
Yeah.
very real things I think we choose to ignore when there are such policies in place, that these policies choose to ignore when, considering that there might be multiple women in one family requiring multiple amounts of sanitary pads, or maybe even other products. I mean, choice has been completely ignored in this equation. Yes, Anuki.
That's why choice becomes so important, because I understand that given the kind of how we've looked at this from a very cultural perspective and the stigma and the taboo we've attached to menstruation in general. I think that's really why we don't talk about these things anyway, and that's why there's such a lack of awareness, even within policymaking tables, on why there needs to, be different products, why the approach to the whole thing needs to be different. But at least for now, if we had choice, then we'd be able to kind of, fix we'd have some solution. And
Yeah.
we'd kind of be able to sort of, I wouldn't say fend for ourselves, but if you have that choice in the market, then you still, you don't have to make those difficult decisions. And right now, we're forcing women to make these decisions. And like you rightly pointed out, I also think it's an issue of rights, because we were having this conversation actually before before the meeting at the PM's office with Malsha's team. And Gayatri, one of their researchers and a part of the team, she was talking about the issue of dignity. Because right now it's massive. I mean, you're stripping sort of a woman's dignity, so to say, right? When you're saying, okay, you can't use pads, you have to use cloth. Imagine going to work with a piece of cloth. Look at the implications of that. Look at going to school. I mean, we have white school uniforms, and how would that work? So this is becoming sort of a bigger issue than it was.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for bringing that issue of dignity into light, Anuki. I mean, I think in terms of how taboo this topic is in Sri Lanka, I think so many of us, especially, girls in school, they have this constant fear of staying in a white uniform. And even us, even considering as progressive as we are, sometimes we do, not sometimes, most of the time we do have that fear, right? Because it also comes with that taboo. So I think dignity is also like a very, I mean, thank you very much for bringing the point up. I'd like to move my attention to Malsha. Masha, I think to tackle this issue of unaffordability, there have been many initiatives, I think, since a few years now, to provide sanitary napkins free of charge. And one such initiative is Free to Flow, that was kind of founded by you. I mean, while acknowledging the fact that providing sanitary napkins for free might not necessarily solve these broadest policy issues of highly taxing imported menstrual products, it is a necessary step to ensure availability and accessibility of menstrual products for low-income earning women and girls. So, Masha, could you walk us through why you started this and what you expect to achieve of this?
Actually, us starting Free to Flow was just, it's a small way we could give a helping hand to women out there. It's just more environmentally friendly to use reusable sanitary napkins. We've seen this movement of reusable ones taking over all over the world, and a lot of women switching to use that. So we just saw that as like a small help, like a helping hand to women. Our broader initiative obviously was to fight the taxes that were imposed on sanitary napkins. And why I say this is because with our exchange rate and us importing all the materials that are needed to make sanitary napkins, it will make the locally produced ones more expensive anyway. So removing the tax on imported sanitary napkins will allow even more cheaper products to be bought in. Because I remember at one time there was a very cheap Indian sanitary napkin product that was being sold. It was, I think it was less than 100 rupees for a pack of 10, which is now obviously no longer available, but because it doesn't make sense to pay those taxes, bring it into Sri Lanka and sell them here. So what we're hoping is with the removal of all sanitary napkins, hopefully one day we'll be able to remove that as well. We will be able to bring sanitary napkins into the country that are actually cheaper, and will make it more accessible for people in rural areas to be able to get their hands on them.
Yeah, thank you very much, Malsha. I think I'd like to remind our viewers that you also can ask your questions. I think there are a few questions that are coming in. And also there's one question related to choice. I think when we talk about choice, like Malsha very correctly pointed out, we are also talking about much cheaper options that can come into the market, which ensures choice in terms of affordability and price, right? That is also a very important aspect of providing choice for women and girls in Sri Lanka. And also, I think another part of choice when we speak about choice is the fact that, even if you're someone who can maybe necessarily afford much more pricier menstrual products, maybe there are certain things that you care about, like it being more environmentally friendly. If you can afford to pay a few more rupees for a product that is much more eco-friendly. So I think these are things also that people really talk about or want to be conscious about when it comes to ensuring choice. Can we talk about that a bit? Lakmini, what are your views on ensuring choice in terms of both price and also in terms of different products being available to different points of people with different, different capabilities of expenditure?
I think we have to look at it from two angles. One is you have to look at the health implication that this has. One, okay, so a study, I think I can't remember the exact date of this, but it's estimated that 1 out of 4 girls have PCOS and 1 out of 10 girls has endometriosis. Now, with PCOS and endometriosis, what you also have to understand is excessive bleeding is part of it. So if this is a large number of the female population that has PCOS or endometriosis. So it's 25 plus 10%, right? Which means that their requirements per month vary significantly to other women and girls. The other part of what we also need to look at is in terms of period poverty, also not just the access to sanitary napkins, it's also the lack of infrastructure that lets women to menstruate, whether they want to use cloth or whether they want to use pads. Now, the fact that the second you go outside Colombo, that there is no water, that there is very little sanitation facilities is a huge hindrance in terms of women and girls using cloth. Now, cloth is not the problem. The problem is the fact that you don't wash it properly and you don't dry it properly. Especially when you go to places like Munaragala, Vilgamo, which are heavily agriculture dependent, like even Anuradhapura and stuff like that, you find a lot of very heavy metals in the water. So it's very, it's not the most sanitary water to be washing period cloth and then using it also. So again, you're predisposing yourself to a variety of bacterial and fungal infections when you don't have proper sanitation facilities to use. So then we go back to infrastructure. Then you go to the hill country where there is high levels of humidity, less sunlight, and again, reusable sanitary napkins are not perhaps the most practical thing to be using because, again, cultural reasons, you don't dry it out properly, high humidity, it's too wet and less sunlight, so you don't dry it properly, again, predispose yourself to a variety of fungal and bacterial infections. So in terms of, this is why it's so important that one, there is variety for women to choose from. So it shouldn't be the government or the state's decision to hinder women's choice, right? Because women also come with various reproductive health issues as well, which require different types of products to be used. So that's one part. And the other part of it is also, of course, when it comes to infrastructure, we also need to ensure that right infrastructure is put in so you have right water, sanitation, and hygiene facilities. Because we did a study in 2018 which revealed that 70% of women and girls actually use sanitary pads. Now, this is because of course, convenience and with the wash facilities not being available, these are also the most convenient options to be using. But the problem there is because it's so heavily taxed, they wear the same sanitary pad for a longer period of time. So again, you're predisposing yourself to a whole range of other bacterial and fungal infections. So again, there is another health cost that the government has to bear, right? So which is why this is all so interconnected, and we need to start the government, actually the state and decision makers need to start understanding that this is all so interlinked. And yeah, of course, I'm going to end it by saying that the government or state should never in any way hinder women's choice to their sexual and reproductive health in any way. Because the trend is to take away the tax. We're still, discussing on whether we should or shouldn't.
Exactly. That's a very important point. So I'd like to redirect the same question to Malsha in a different way. I mean, talking about alternatives for sanitary napkins, right? I mean, you're essentially making women vulnerable to urogenital infections and even very serious diseases like cervical cancer, even though there is low incidence of cervical cancer in Sri Lanka. Low incidence does not necessarily mean that you're not vulnerable to it, right? So, I mean, these are very serious things that policymakers and policy implementers need to take into consideration when I mean, a certain aspect of the fiscal policy cannot target 51.6% of the population, right? I think that's where the conversation should start. And Marsha, I know that you've done a lot of work with the communities. You worked with many women, especially in terms of your initiative, Free to Flow. Could you share some stories that you've kind of, learned from these women? Could you walk us through the importance of removing this tax on menstrual products in order to ensure availability and affordability in terms of, the many stories that you may have heard or experienced in terms of working with these women?
Yeah, we've spoken to a lot of women while we've been working on the road, and it's kind of sad, and it really even affects us while listening to it. One of the the biggest stories was the fact that some women do bleed longer than the others, and really does affect them when they if I need one pack of pads, maybe Anuki might need four, and when you're earning 1,200 rupees a day or even less as a daily wage worker, it makes it impossible. And some of these households has a mother, a daughter-in-law, and two daughters, so that are all surviving off this daily wage. So it's very difficult because they have to choose between food or sanitary napkins, and it's a choice a woman shouldn't have to make, and it's a very sad situation to be in.
Right, thank you so much, Marsha. And I think something else that we also have to talk about the emotional impact. I think we touched on this a bit when we started our conversation earlier. The emotional impact, lack of access to menstrual products have on women. So, Anuki, I'd like to move my attention to you. I mean, this is something that we've kind of talked about in the recent report that we released in collaboration with Oxfam as well. It has been, but we did a literature review and we found out that academically also it has been found that, this has a very real emotional impact, especially on the overall school experience of schoolgirls and also working women, right? The level of comfort that they work in, the level of comfort and ease that they study in, these are very real issues. So, Anuki, let's talk about the emotional and psychological, the impact this has on the emotional and psychological well-being of menstruating women and girls in Sri Lanka.
Sure. I mean, Sathya, at the end of the day, even for me, it's only now that, when we're reading research and literature that I look back and I think, oh God, yeah, this does take a this has taken a toll probably on all of us. And I think the situations are such that, we also learn to adapt, and we also think, we don't have another option, right? So we've got to straddle on, we've got to figure out a way, to make sure you don't bleed on your uniforms at school, nobody sees, you're all good. So I think now looking back to it and to everybody listening in, of course, I mean, this has huge impacts on our psychological well-being and health, especially when it comes to schoolgirls. There have been studies in the past, where certain parents, I think there was a study by the UNFPA, if I remember right, or WASH, around how about 60%, this is just in the Karunarathne district, but about 60% of parents were less inclined to send their girls to school on days of menstruation. So that little things like that are what I would point to when we talk about sort of the psychological effects on it, because I think it affects you as a mom, or a dad. If you can't sort of provide for your kids, that's a problem, and that's something that we're seeing now and hearing now. And then as a student, as a young schoolgirl, it's another problem, because now you've got to make do with that 1-2 pads you have every day. And like Lucky pointed out, we don't have period-friendly toilets in Sri Lanka. In most schools, especially the more you go into, the rural parts of the country, younger girls and older girls have to share one washroom because, generally if it's a smaller school, there's only 2 for the 2 genders. And that makes it difficult too, because you don't have a way to dispose of your sanitary napkin or anything else, or wash up too. So that again is another strain. So that's what I could think of education wise. And then workforce wise, it's quite difficult too, because we don't, here we are reading up, and and seeing these stories about menstrual, like period leave, and then things like that, just to help make the environment more conducive for women. I've read up about companies, Fortune 500 companies, having these tools and mechanisms where when women are menstruating, they have safe space. I mean, just little things that make it easier to work. But we don't have provisions for any of that
Yeah, and
here.
also Sri
And
Lanka is a huge issue in terms of female labor force participation, right? It has been
exactly.
going back and forth between 30 to 37%, if I'm not mistaken, for the past few decades. So,
Yeah,
I mean, essentially, while this is not necessarily the only issue that has contributed to Sri Lanka's female labor force participation to be low, it's
this
definitely
should
one of the
be.
issues, I
Yeah,
assume, right?
this really
Because, I
should
mean,
be.
menstruation is a real issue. Every woman has to experience it
Yeah,
every month. So, if a country's policies are not very sensitive to it, I mean, I'd assume it might have some level of
yeah,
impact in terms
it
of female
should.
labor force participation. And the
Yeah,
numbers, we see it from the numbers, right?
yeah. And we
I'd
have,
like to know, yes, of course, go ahead,
sorry,
Anka.
just to add, no, we have very women heavy sectors like apparel, plantation, where women
Exactly.
are the driving force of it. So I just don't understand why even to date this has to be, conversed in depth to this level. But I just want to add, Sati, if you don't mind, and this is not
Of course, yes.
related to the psychological impact of it. This is related to the taxes, if you don't mind me going back to it.
Yeah, of
Just
course, yes.
because there was a tax reform just a few days ago, and I see this happen every time there's a tax reform.
Mm.
While there's a part of the population, mostly women, who feel the impact of this, you be happy and thankful for, and then hope for lower prices in the horizon. We do see a part of people who will constantly, talk about why there couldn't have been an alternative solution, why the product couldn't be
Mm.
manufactured here, um,
Mm.
why we need to do something like this at a time like this. So I just wanted to address that, because I've been seeing a lot of sort of tweets and comments about it, and it is a
Yes.
little frustrating, because every few years, whenever there's a little win, there's always sort of those things about, why can't it be made here? It can, and it should be made here, but if it could be, and it should be cost effective. We're not trying to curtail production of any sort. All we're saying is give
Mm.
women that choice. And I
Yeah.
think it's been years of demanding for that. And if we don't see local production step up, or if we don't see that happen already, then why not have an alternative in the market? I just wanted to sort of bring that up, because there's been lots of
Yeah, and it's
comments and
also
chatter around
about
that.
making the policy environment conducive for local producers to be price competitive, to provide them incentives
Exactly.
to improve the quality of their products, to improve the
Exactly.
variety of their products, to ensure that menstruating women and girls in Sri Lanka do have access and the affordability is ensured in terms of the retail prices that,
Yeah.
I just read out the price increases of retail
Yeah.
prices just from last year to May of this year. So
Yeah.
it's simply about allowing the policy environment for local producers to be price competitive, to
Yeah.
provide them incentive to improve the quality and variety of their products.
Yeah.
I'd like
And
to
not
go
to be
back to
rent
the
seeking.
issue. Exactly. Yes, Masha, go ahead.
Some of the tweets I've actually got about this was the fact that we are promoting imported products allows that there might be job losses in Sri Lanka for the pad makers in Sri Lanka. Actually, the making of pads is completely mechanical. It's done by machines. Nothing can be handmade because of the germ factor. If anything is, it's not. That they can't sell it basically. So there is absolutely this thing that if there's imported things, people in Sri Lanka will lose jobs is absolute nonsense. It's not true, because it doesn't take a lot of manpower to create it, and it's all machine done. So I just thought I'd point that out as well.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you so much for that. Lakmini, I'd like to move my attention to this whole issue of menstruation and schoolgirls, right? Simply because of the fact that I know you've done a lot of work with the community, you worked a lot with, young schoolgirls, especially on this issue. I mean, we spoke about how, the lack of access to menstrual products impacts the overall school experience for girls, the pain, the discomfort, the fear of staining a white uniform. These are very real things. I mean, we're all girls here. I mean, we've gone to school, we've gone through that process of wearing a white uniform, not having a sanitary napkin with us. Imagine not having a sanitary napkin because you can't buy it and you have that fear constantly throughout your life. So I mean, Lakmini, can you walk us through the experiences, the stories that you've learned, by working with these girls, the school girls, the real impact this issue actually has, the lack of accessibility to menstrual products have on school girls?
So I think so. I mean, the stories are sad and sometimes horrific because these are things that could be avoided. So it's really it's disheartening because these are issues that could easily be avoided because self-esteem, especially in school, and your performance in school has a big effect on your overall self-esteem as an adult. So when you have traumatic, so staining your white uniform is one of the most traumatic experience a girl can go through because for the rest of her life she's going to be bullied, right? Also, we have to understand that the second you go outside of Colombo, majority of the schools are co-ed, so there's boys and girls in school. If you are even slightly stained, I bet you the girl will not end up coming to school forever. She'll just stop. Either she'll change schools or she'll just not come to school because the embarrassment is so high, right? So, and it's also sad because these are all things that could be avoided and could very easily be avoided. And because of this, also there's also a whole plethora of myths that are created to kind of endorse these things. Now, one of the myths that I consistently come upon is, especially in schools, is if a boy sees your stain, apparently it's like really bad luck for him. So not for her, but really bad luck for him. So you have to like so you give way for like all these myths to come about as well because you don't address the real issue, and these are all very simple things that could be addressed. Have sanitary pads available freely in schools. Why not? I mean, this is the education right of 52% of the population, right? Girl children have equal access to education as much as a boy child, and you can't stop that girl child's ability to go to school because of a biological process she can't stop. So I think that's I think also the rights approach we also need to start looking into because this is ridiculous. And like Malsha pointed out, I mean, if this happened to men, I mean, we wouldn't be here having this discussion because let's not forget that the decision makers in parliament are 95% men, right? We have less than 5% of women in parliament. So this is, again, goes back to the fact that we need to start getting women in all cross sections, right? We need to start getting sensitive policymakers in power in place so that you address not just period poverty, but you also address a plethora of other things that are also interrelated because you address the labor force issue, you address the absenteeism in school, you address the mental health issues as well, because a lot of girls come out of school feeling extremely with a lot of low self-esteem and things like that. So also addressing a lot of other things if we can just be more gender sensitive. So yeah, again, state should not in any way hinder our choice.
Thank you, Lakmini. With that, I'd like to move on to Malsha. Malsha is a woman in politics. I think let's talk about gender insensitive policies as a whole, right? So even in the past, even though there have been changes to revise, the overall taxation on menstrual products, sometimes it has been a result of overall tax revisions as a whole, not because someone said we want to reduce tariffs, taxes imposed on menstrual products per se. So let's talk about gender insensitive policies. As a woman in politics and policy, what do you feel? Why do you think this happened?
I mean, when there's a bunch of men at the table discussing what is best for a woman, they're obviously not going to see this as an unfair or a sexist tax. So like Lakmini said, like the whole problem is there's a bunch of people who don't really understand what the issue is, making decisions on behalf of the women. It's always, if you really think about it, we have so many men in the cabinet that even the women's ministry is given to a man just because they need to fill a seat, right? And to them it's probably like I've actually spoken to a minister who was a man who was given the women's ministry, and he told me he was very insulted by it. So he spent his entire 6 years of his term in office being embarrassed about it, really didn't do anything. And so are we surprised that there's absolutely no policy decision changes for us? The finance minister is always a man, so they're always looking for ways on increasing their flow of money into the government. So, I mean, I don't know what else to say other than get more women into parliament, but I don't see that happening either. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I'd like to revisit that topic of alternatives for menstrual products, right? I mean, unafford as much as, we have to commend this removal of the 15% general duty, there's still that 10% PAL and 15% cess, right? So unaffordability is still very much in question. It's very much something that we still need to talk about, right? So how do we, while we advocate for the removal of these tariffs, like I explained earlier, how do we look for more safer and affordable solutions? Anuki, do you want to start the conversation from there and we'll progress with the other?
Sure. So Sathya, I really think so. Already we have globally there's a huge movement and conversion towards sustainable, menstrual alternatives to the product. Period cups are used widely all over the world, actually quite used in Sri Lanka as well.
Yeah.
But see, with sort of the taboos and the myths that we associate with menstruation, there is a little bit of hesitancy within certain communities within certain communities, age groups, etc., to move to some of these products. But I do think that just over the past few years, I've noticed that anyway globally, just about 5-6 years ago, I think is when sort of the movements around ending taxes on periods started to happen. And with that came that movement of sustainable sanitation. So I feel like we're headed towards that conversation here as well. There's products in the market which are great alternatives. The rising cost of living is also making, people look into different alternatives. So things like reusable sanitary napkins can make all the difference. I do remember the issue with reusable sanitary napkins is that, and this is a conversation that these guys, we've had, I've had with, I've had with an apparel manufacturer who makes reusable sanitary napkins for the US market. They were talking about how, a study they've done here, and something common to South Asia was that women, like you said, they use the cloth, but they don't wash it, put it under direct sunlight for it to dry up. And so, that causes more bacterial infection. So I think we need to take, step-by-step approaches. But I do think that there's lots of grassroots organizations already working to push sustainable forms of sanitation. So that conversation is happening, and I think we'll see the change. But this is why choice is important. It's only when you have choice that you think, okay, there is another product that I can move to. There is another product that perhaps is cheaper or perhaps works better for me, but I need to have access to those products to make those decisions. So I think, with improving accessibility and availability, we'll slowly sort of see the conversation change. And at least that's what I'm hoping.
Thank you, Anuki. I'd like to pose the same question to Lakmini. Lakmini, as someone who's worked with communities very closely, I must say, how do you view, making sure the alternatives that are available are affordable and most importantly safe?
So alternatives, this is the thing. So in terms of anything with an insertion is a big no-no, anything outside Colombo. So tampons, period cups, period discs, all of them are a big fat cross. So that's not even something we tried to, but we found out that it was hugely just rejected by the community because there's a whole problem of virginity and all sorts of other mythical things that they believe in anyway. So dealing with, we also have to work in the cultural context that we work in without, you have to work around the problem also to a certain extent. This is the thing.
That's an important point that you brought up there, Lakmini, because there are already so many issues surrounding menstruation in terms of taboo and culture and etc. And on top of that, there is this tax that women have to deal with. So thank you very much for bringing that point. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is the thing. The amount of times I've heard that you can't bathe during your period and you can't eat fried food and you can't eat brinjal or sprouts or all sorts of things. This is the thing, when you don't have the right education to the fact that we still don't have proper sexual reproductive health in schools is also one of the leading causes of these myths to come about. And the fact that women don't even know what variety they're talking about, because I mean, even girls who went to private schools in Colombo, only girls schools, how I've had so many of my friends who've said, oh, I've never, we've never been taught about menstruation or what to use or how to use, right? So we're still living in that very bleak reality, whether you're going to the rural sector or whether you're coming to Colombo. But in terms of diversity, this is the thing. By taking out these taxes, you're also allowing innovation. Currently, because it's so heavily taxed, you have one major player who owns about 85% of the market share, who controls it, and then you have about 2 or 3 other smaller players who don't get to, so there is not room for innovation. The second you take taxation out of it, right, you're allowing innovation to happen as well. Because right now we only have, if I'm not mistaken, we only have one completely biodegradable brand of sanitary napkins. The rest of it are made out of cotton and other, I think, I'm not sure if synthetic is the right word, but not completely biodegradable, right? So this is because you hinder innovation when you tax something so basic, right? Look at the amount of varieties of, I don't know, things that are not taxed that are there. Actually, if you take a look at even, I mean, cigarettes that are used mostly by men, look at the amount of innovation you're allowing that, but you don't harness the same kind of innovation for something like a sanitary napkin, which affects 52% of the population, that is also a right for women and girls to use. So this is, again, we go back to the fact that this is so gendered, and the fact that, we don't have an overall gender budgeting and all of that. So yeah, in terms of variety, like I said, if we are also allowing innovation, we also have to allow the right infrastructure. Because if we are to go with reusable sanitary pads, if we're going to be using cloth and other alternatives, which is all fine, right? But you also need to give populations the right infrastructure, like the right water and sanitation facilities as well, or allow innovation that creates fabric that doesn't need so much washing or drying. Because there is also that alternative, which unfortunately Sri Lanka doesn't see, because we're so hell-bent on taxing something that is so essential. So this is the thing, you hinder innovation by taxing something that is so essential.
Yeah, that's so true, because I think in other countries, things like underwear that can be worn during menstruation, that is so widely available. I think in Sri Lanka, it was introduced very, very recently, and also a very small segment of the population, female population, even has access to it, even knows that even exists and can even afford it. So I think
Yeah.
choice is a very important thing. I'd like to direct the same question to Malsha. Malsha, I mean, once again, I know you also work with communities, especially with your initiative, Free to Flow. How do you ensure this problem of, I mean, yes, while we advocate to remove these tariffs that are still applicable on menstrual products, how do we ensure this problem is still very real, right? It's still quite very unaffordable. So how do we ensure that the alternatives that are available is actually safe?
So one thing we have been trying to push through our initiative is the change of using other sanitary sanitary products. So we actually had a research while we were distributing our reusable sanitary napkins. We passed around a questionnaire. We asked the women, are you more open to using tampons or maybe the period cup? Because what we do is we want it to be sustainable. So, hello. Can you
Yes,
hear
we
me?
can hear you. Go on. Yeah, you disconnected there for a few minutes, but it's fine in a few seconds, but you can go ahead.
So what we wanted to do was promote the period cup as well, because it was more sustainable. It can be used longer than the reusable sanitary napkins. But then again, the whole issue was with every woman was the fact that they didn't want to have something they had to insert into their body. And they also didn't want young girls using these products because they felt like it affected their virginity. And some women were also worried how inserting something would affect them in how their husband felt about them. So it's very funny. It's a very sad situation that, women are facing. And we're hoping that in the future, with we spoke about infrastructure and sanitation, we're hoping maybe the schools I mean, we're in a time where kids are doing their exams under umbrellas, so I guess I'm just being very positive. We're hoping better sanitation, like better toilets for the girls to be able to, you know, freely do what they need to do. And yeah.
Thank you very much, Malsha. I think we've been speaking for nearly an hour now. I think this is a topic that we can speak for hours, and I think people have been for years, actually. I mean, I'll start off with Anuki. So, I mean, I think we've come to the, last few minutes of the conversation. Anuki, any parting thoughts? I think I'll leave the three of you to give your parting thoughts, and we can kind of, end the conversation from there today.
Right. So my parting thought is for us to rally behind and try to improve access to the product. I think that's what the goal should be. And this, via reducing the tariff, via reducing a tax, if we can take off the VAT at some point, I think that would be great. This applies to local production too, because, it would still, because taking that tax off means, and it should translate to a reduction in the retail price, because that's the only way women are going to benefit from it. And that's really what this whole fight is for, really, to make the product more affordable. So I think that we have to prioritize increasing accessibility through the reduction of prices, that is through the reduction of taxes, through the through allowing for new products to come into our market. We're a small country, small population, but 52% of it are menstruating women. 52% of it are women, and out of that, a certain million amount of menstruating women. So
about 5
I think
million, between 15 to
million.
14 million. Yeah.
Yes. So that we need to have products accessible to that population, and so I think allowing more products to come in should be a priority. And the point that Lakmini brought up about innovation and having allowing an environment where we innovate in this field, I think is also very critical, if we are to tackle the problem of period poverty in some way. And to everyone watching the live, I'm just thank you for listening to us go on for an hour. But you being here for an hour means that you do see this as an issue too. So wherever you can lend your voice, because the more people we talk to, the more we realize too that this is still maybe because of the taboo attached to it, maybe it's still such a sort of closed off topic. It's not even something that even within women's circles, it's not something that is really discussed in priority. So if you can start those conversations with your friends, with your family around a dinner table, I mean, I think that would still sort of propel some change, because then it'll get more people talking about it. It'll get more people at least trying to look up what the issue is. Now there's research. There wasn't a few years ago. Now there's quite a bit of research if you are interested to read up about the financial impacts of period poverty, how it affects health, education, etc. If you want to be better informed. So those are my departing thoughts.
Thank you, Anuki. Thank you so much. Malsha, I'll leave it to you. And I know that you also have your initiative Free to Flow. So if you can go ahead and mention how anybody can contribute, I think that will also be helpful in terms of helping to make the situation better.
I think, you can get in touch with us through social media. That's pretty much how we operate. But I would also like to say something. We shouldn't allow our local producers of pads to monopolize this situation and exploit women by keeping their markups high and still selling their pads at a price that the imported pads also sold as. And I know that there have been these conversations now that we have been trying to get cess and pal also removed. Certain people have been getting riled up and trying to stop this from happening. I hope, that doesn't happen. I hope we can go ahead with this, because our whole initiative here, what we're looking forward to doing is to increase the amount of pads that come into Sri Lanka, to increase the choice that women have, and that is what's important. And if a local producer can't make a product that can fight against what's imported, they're not doing a good job, right? You can't stop the imports from coming in because you can't keep up. So we have to give up a good fight.
Thank you very much, Malsha. I think how Malsha highlighted the importance of competition. Lakmini, any parting thoughts?
I think touching upon what both Malsha and Anuki said, I think firstly, we need to continue this conversation. I think until we reach where we want to, this conversation needs to go. And regardless of who you are, whether you're a girl, a boy, man, whatever you identify yourself as, I think this conversation needs to go further. We need to keep discussing, because reality of the situation is by imposing such a high tax on something so essential, what you're also doing is you're hindering the economy and the health. You're increasing the health cost overall. So if we're looking at this from a holistic angle, the more we talk about it, the more it helps. So I think we shouldn't. So while we also discuss that we obviously need to take away this taxation, we also need to talk about the requirement for sexual reproductive health in schools and the lack of infrastructure. We need to start prioritizing those things. And the other part of it is also, we need to start understanding that the government in no way should hinder a woman's choice to whatever she wants to choose or buy or whatever she wants to do in terms of managing her menstruation, because it's her right. Especially women and girls, if they want to partake in school, or in the formal economy, it should not be hindered by the government or the state. So yeah, and let's continue this conversation till we meet where we want to, till we get what we want.
Thank you very much, Lakmini. I mean, thank you for all three of you, Anuki, Malsha, and Lakmini, for joining in on this conversation. Today, we spoke about why Sri Lanka shouldn't tax imported menstrual products. I mean, this conversation was organized in light of the recent 15% general duty removal. So while we highly commend that policy move, while we welcome it, I think our attention should be on the fact that there is still a 10% PAL and a 15% cess. And I think once again, I'd like to highlight the fact that, these tariffs tend to trickle down to the final retail price, making imported sanitary napkins and menstrual products quite unaffordable and expensive in the domestic market. And also it helps to create an environment where local producers can make supernormal profits, meaning profits than they should ideally make. And that once again, those supernormal profits are made at the expense of 5 million menstruating women and girls in Sri Lanka between the ages of 15 to 49. So in this 5 million menstruating women, there are also menstruating women and girls who are low income earning and who might not necessarily have large amounts of money, to even purchase menstrual products. So once again, while we highly commend this move by the government to remove the general duty applicable on imported menstrual products, I think I think the conversation should be on further advocating for reforms such as the removal of the 10% PAL and the 15% cess. So once again, thank you, Anuki, Malsha, and Lakmini, for joining in with us. I know all three of you have been doing a lot of work for many years, and I hope that you can continue this good effort and fight the good fight, so that we can achieve this this goal of completely removing tariffs that is imposed on imported menstrual products in Sri Lanka. So once again, everyone, thank you very much for joining in with Advocata for this conversation. So many of you joined, so many of you had many questions. Thank you very much. Once again, I'd like to remind you that you can find similar policy discussions on our Advocata page, which you can find on Instagram, on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube. You can find similar Sinhala content, which we try to have these similar conversations in Sinhala policy discussions. You can find Advocata Plus on Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and Twitter. And also, we have been able to launch a Tamil page where we discuss these policy issues in Tamil, and we've called it Advocata Kural. Right now, we are only available on Facebook. So please do give us a follow and check that out on Facebook as well. So once again, thank you very much for joining in. We'd hope to meet you once again with a similar discussion. Thank you very much for all three of you. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye, Sathya. Thanks for having us.
Having us.
Thank you. Bye, girls.
Bye.
Bye.